Good day. Today is Wednesday, 29th January 2025, and I'm going to start this program with a short personal announcement, which is briefly this. On Friday, Saturday and Sunday of this week, in Belfast on Friday, in Dublin on Saturday, and in Manchester on Sunday, the former CIA agent, or officer I should say, John Kiriakou, will be giving an address describing his life as a CIA official, and the lectures are each entitled A Life with the Ex-CIA. Now, I understand that the event on Friday, the 31st of January, is completely sold out, but there are still tickets available for anyone in Dublin or in Manchester on Saturday and Sunday if they're interested. I gather there's not many tickets, but there are still a few. Now, the reason I mention this, apart from the fact that anything that John Kiriakou, a heroic whistleblower who exposed torture by the CIA and went to prison for it, and who, in my opinion, is someone who most definitely should deserve a presidential pardon. Apart from the fact that he's going to be the main speaker, I should say that one of the participants in these meetings, moderating the discussion, will be none other than my wife, Dr. Catherine Brown. So if you want to get to know Catherine, many of you have heard things about her over the course of these programs and are interested in the, in fact, extremely interesting topics of these programs. Well, topics of these lectures, I should say. Well, as I said, this is your opportunity. You can buy up some tickets for the event in Dublin on Saturday, and the event in Manchester on Sunday. And, well, you can listen. You'll have a very, very interesting discussion with John Kiriakou, and you will see Catherine in person and in action. And if I say so myself, a very formidable force that will prove to be. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's now move on and discuss the events that I want to discuss in these programs. And I'm going to begin, first of all, by dealing with a number of issues that have come up, which are important in themselves, but perhaps they're less part of the substantive discussions that we've been getting on these programs. The first is that, like many, many people, I am deeply troubled by the handling of the Auschwitz liberation ceremonies that have taken place in Auschwitz. The way in which Russia, whose soldiers, well, of course, it was the Soviet Union, but as we all know, Russia was the major military component of the Soviet military, and the capital, after all, of the Soviet Union was Moscow, and Moscow continues to be the capital of the Russian Federation. And the Russians, I think it's now generally accepted, made up the greater part of the men who fought in the Red Army. Anyway, Russia has, for I believe the third year in a row, been excluded from the Auschwitz commemorations. And it is particularly hard in this occasion, since I understand that this was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it wasn't just that the Russians were prevented from attending, they weren't granted any invitations to come. But I have noticed with some dismay that there has been a consistent attempt on the part of some sections of the media to write them completely out of the story. There was an extraordinary editorial in The Guardian, for example, which managed to discuss the liberation of Auschwitz without even mentioning exactly who it was that liberated Auschwitz. Now, I think that is very troubling. It is politicization of one of the most tragic episodes of the 20th century. And in terms of the liberation of Auschwitz, one of the most consequential episodes of the 20th century, to serve current political purposes. Now, I'm not going to say more about this. Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, who writes wonderfully well for Responsible Statecraft, and also has his own exceptional Substack blog, has written a fine piece about this, which basically says all that I would want to say. And you can go to Ian Proud's piece and you can read it there. What I personally would say is that another very disturbing boundary has been crossed. I am particularly dismayed, and I have to say this, shocked would not be too strong a word, by the continued behaviour of, well, some sections of the British media, and I have mentioned The Guardian already, the role that they're playing in all of this. And frankly, I consider it a betrayal of the alliance that this country had with the Soviet Union in the Second World War, where Britain, and I'm a British citizen, and the Soviet Union, which means the Russian people, fought together against one of the most terrible tyrannies that has ever existed, and achieved between them the liberation of Europe and the end of the terrible events that took place in Auschwitz and in so many other places. Anyway, let me move on and now talk about more contemporary political things. One of the most strange stories over the last few months, ever since the collapse of the Assad government in Syria in early December, is this very strange, very tangled story of the two Russian bases in Syria, the one in Tartus and the other in Khmeimim. Now, satellite pictures that have appeared seem to show that the Khmeimim air base is almost completely idle. There appears to be considerable activity at the moment at the Tartus naval base in the east of Syria. But from what I can tell, what the pictures appear to show is Russian ships, military supply ships, loading equipment in Tartus, suggesting that Tartus is also in the process of being evacuated. Now, about a week ago, the Syrian authorities announced that they were cancelling a contract that had been agreed by the Assad government for the maintenance by a Russian company of the port of Tartus. Now, it needs to be stressed that this is the civilian port of Tartus, which is a Syrian port. It does not extend to the naval base. And one of the unanswered questions about what would happen when Assad fell is about what would happen to these bases. The European Union has made it absolutely clear that it will not be providing any sort of economic assistance to Syria. It will not even lift sanctions on Syria until these bases, these Russian bases, are closed. Something, by the way, which I should say I find absolutely outrageous. The purpose of the sanctions was originally justified by the supposed crimes real and imagined, of the Assad government. The Assad government has now gone, overthrown by precisely the forces that the Western powers were supporting for so many years in Syria. And yet the sanctions remain, and they are being justified by this entirely extraneous issue of the presence of these Russian bases, even as people in Syria, the Syrian people, continue to suffer acute hardship as a result of those sanctions. For the record, despite the fall of the Assad government, there's been no word so far from the United States that they are relaxing their sanctions on the Syrian government either. The notorious on Syria either. The notorious Caesar sanctions, for example, remain in place. Anyway, despite the fall of Assad, despite these demands from the European Union, and so far, by the way, the United States, both under Biden and Trump, has said very little about this. Despite all of that, the Russian bases, in theory at least, continue. They're still there. The Russians still have base agreements with the previous Syrian government, and the new Syrian authorities have not taken any step to interfere with those bases. Even though, as I said, Khmeimim itself, judging from the satellite pictures, is now almost deserted. Well, over the last couple of days, a strong Russian delegation arrived in Syria. The head of the delegation is a deputy foreign minister, Mr. Bogdanov, who is the Russian official within the Russian foreign ministry, who has overall responsibility for Russian policy in the Middle East. But perhaps an even more important member of the delegation is another Russian diplomat, Ambassador at Large Leontiev, who has in fact been Russia's point man, diplomatic point man, over Syrian matters, specifically on Syrian matters, the man who's held the Syrian brief within the Russian foreign ministry for many years now. And of course, he is someone that all of the Syrian parties, including Jelani and his people, will be very, very familiar with. Anyway, this delegation arrived in Damascus, and they had a meeting with Jelani himself. I will, by the way, continue to refer to him as Jelani. He has now started using his actual name, but most of the world knows him as Al-Jelani, and I will stick by that for the moment, with the important proviso that everybody should know that this is not his actual name, but a nom de guerre, a military name that he has given himself, that he gave himself, and which currently he is no longer using. But I'm going to stick for consistency, just with the practice, at least for the moment, of calling him Jelani. Anyway, they met with Jelani, and they met with other Syrian officials. And it looks as if there was some discussion, again, about the issue of the bases. But mostly, the purpose of the meeting, which apparently was quite friendly, was to discuss what role in future Russia might have in Syria. Now, I've talked about this topic in the past. I've said that the Syrians, the new Syrian authorities, and Erdogan, who basically controls them, probably for their own very specific reasons, want the Russians to remain in Syria. The reason they want the Russians there is because the presence of the Russians gives them leverage over the other two big parties present in Syria at the present time, one of which is, of course, Israel, and the other is the United States. If the Russians are in Syria, Russia, a military, nuclear superpower. It provides the Turks and the new Syrian authorities with a degree of leverage and a degree of pressure over the Israelis and the Americans, with both the Americans and the Israelis reluctant to tangle militarily with the Russians. Something which, by the way, has been shown to be consistently true ever since the Russian intervention in Syria began way back in 2015. So, the Russians come along. There is this very, very friendly meeting. The Russians apparently came in saying, look, we are anxious to maintain a long-standing relationship with Syria. And the Syrians came back and said, well, we appreciate your coming. We too want to maintain a long-term relationship with Syria, but we would like some, well, the Russian media refer to it as compensation. The British media, the Financial Times, spoke about reparations, except it immediately acknowledged, if you go to the body of the article in which it reported the subject, that the term reparations was not used. It seems that basically what the Syrians asked for, and it is completely predictable, and what you would expect in this kind of complex negotiation that takes place in the Middle East. They basically asked for money. Now, what money they are seeking, apparently there was no actual number put up. There was some talk, apparently, of Russia undertaking investments in Syria, something the Russians were prepared to do whilst Bashar al-Assad was president, something which they offered to do, but which Assad refused. And by the way, I've now had explanations for this, which is that apparently, whilst Assad led Syria, the policy of the Syrian Arab Republic, which he led, apparently restricted, and this went back to the time of his father, it restricted foreign investment inside the Syrian economy. The Syrian economy under the Assads was theoretically socialist, and Syria, for all kinds of reasons, for all sorts of reasons at that time, this is very much consistent with the practice of 1960s and 1970s global South socialism of that era. It basically opposed foreign investment, which it saw as a mechanism towards re-establishing a kind of neo-colonial system in the country. So anyway, that was apparently the reason why the Syrians rejected Russian proposals for big loans and development investment by Russia in Syria, and why the Syrians also apparently turned their backs on Chinese offers of investment as well, whilst Assad was in power. I think that this is only a partial explanation. I suspect that there were feelings that if the Russians and the Chinese came in that kind of way, I suspect that there were feelings in Assad's inner circle and amongst the various Syrian business groups that were connected to the Assad regime, that if the Russians and the Chinese came in that kind of big way, then the various business groups in Syria that were already running the economy, and perhaps their Arab friends, might find themselves marginalized and shunted to one side. But anyway, that was apparently the reason that was given. Anyway, the new authorities in Syria have no such inhibitions. They make no pretense that they're socialists in any shape or form. or even economic sovereigntists. They say that they intend to run an open free market economy. And unlike the Assads, for that reason, they welcome foreign investment. But anyway, they asked for money and they asked for Russian investment. They apparently said that the Russians should be keen to offer this investment in order to build trust, to show that this was some sort of compensation. And the Russians, who must have expected it, heard what the Syrians were asking for, and they went back to Moscow, and apparently another dialogue is set to continue. Now, whether or not at the end of the day the Russians decide that all this is worthwhile remains to be seen. It's probably, this being the Middle East, not a good idea to come up with too many proposals too quickly. If Jelani and his people are offered, say, $5 billion for the bases, they will come back and demand 20. Just saying, this is the Middle East. The best thing to do is to run this long, and I suspect that that is precisely what the Russians are going to do. The very fact that the Syrian authorities, the new Syrian authorities, are asking for money is perhaps the strongest indication up to now that they do indeed want the bases to stay. Whether the Russians are prepared to offer money, whether they're prepared to offer money on the scale that the new Syrian authorities, and by the way, the Turks, would want, that is a completely different matter, and it remains to be seen. So, a complex discussion, the usual Middle East dealing and wheeling and dealing, and we will see where it goes. By the way, on the topic of Syria, and returning to another issue that I discussed recently on one of these programs, and which was also discussed by myself and Alex Christoforou on another program that we did on the Duran. I understand that the Qatari authorities have been issuing further comments over the last few days, reiterating their disinterest in plans to create pipelines, gas pipelines across Syria. I'm not saying that that project is completely dead. There's always a possibility with pipeline projects that it might be resurrected at some point in the future. But Qatar, having massively invested in LNG, being perfectly happy with the enormous business in LNG that it now has, doesn't seem to be interested in this pipeline. If Erdogan and Jolani thought that it might be, for the moment they are disappointed, and that might be another reason why they're turning to the Russians for help. So there we are. That's what I wanted to say about the Syrian situation. Now, let me return now to the big and important topic of the conflict in Ukraine, because there's been some very, very important developments, mostly coming from Moscow, over the last 24 hours. And before I do, there's something I have to say that originates from a program, an interview that Tucker Carlson and Matt Taibbi did together just 2 or 3 days ago. Over the course of it, Tucker Carlson said that the Biden administration in its last weeks had made a decision or had come up with some kind of a plan. His words are said very much in passing and very unclear, to arrange the assassination of President Putin of Russia. And Tucker also said that, again, in the last weeks of the Biden administration, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was practically out of control and was doing everything that he possibly could, in effect, to escalate the war in Ukraine, and in fact to escalate it to the point where potentially, this is what I understand Tucker to have said, this is my understanding of Tucker's words, escalated to the point that the United States might even itself eventually become more deeply involved. Well, these comments that Tucker Carlson has made have been picked up in Moscow, and they have provoked a very strong reaction there. So Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has come back and he said that the Russian security service is making absolutely sure that Putin himself remains securely protected. Peskov has said that the Russians had no information that the Americans were behind any kind of assassination plot. And he has, without actually criticizing Tucker, he's basically asked, well, you know, this is a pretty astonishing claim. What is the information behind it? And Peskov has also said that all kinds of stories and rumors of this kind regularly circulate, and the Russians are concerned that mostly they're baseless. Now, about Tony Blinken, that he was the most hardline figure that the former administration had amongst the top level, cabinet level officials. About that, I don't think anybody any longer has any doubt. He undoubtedly was the person who was consistently pressing most single-mindedly for support for Kiev and for the escalation of support for Kiev. As Tucker correctly says, he seems to have been the person who lobbied hardest for missile strikes against Russian territory, for example. So that, for me, is not new. But I think that if Tucker actually has information that there was a decision made, or at least a discussion within the administration, the Biden administration, in its last few weeks to organize, to arrange the murder of Vladimir Putin, then I think he ought to disclose what it was. I think we need to know a little bit more about information. We need to know the information, the full information that lies behind that claim, so that we can assess how serious that idea was, and perhaps try and at least verbally, if nothing else, hold the perpetrators of this disastrous and crazy scheme, which could have led to an all-out military confrontation between Russia and the West, disclosed it, so that, you know, hold these people who came up with it to account in some way. I don't think one should make an allegation of that kind and just leave it out there without providing further explanation of it. Since we're on the topic of Tony Blinken, there is, I think, a further point here, by the way, that I do feel I need to make. Just as Tony Blinken was a fervid advocate of escalation in terms of the Ukraine war, as I've discussed in previous programs, he was also a fervid advocate of support for Israel and for all of Netanyahu's various projects during the conflict that began in Gaza with the Hamas attack of 7th October 2023. Now, there's been a lot of anger and outrage in the Middle East and elsewhere about Donald Trump's comments over the weekend about how Gaza needs to be cleaned out and about how the entire population of Gaza needs to be moved out of Gaza so that it can be rebuilt in some way, with no indication that Trump himself expects the Palestinian population of Gaza to return. And many people are rightly saying that that is a shocking proposal and that it in effect demands the displacement of an entire population, coming on top of the displacement of Palestinians that has been taking place on the territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine consistently ever since the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, and that this would simply be another and completely disastrous expression of that. Anyway, many people rightly are outraged by these words of Donald Trump. What they're not aware of or choose to ignore, even though this is fully documented, is that in the autumn of 2023, it became the policy of the Biden administration to do exactly the same thing. Prime Minister Netanyahu at that time apparently already had a plan to displace the entire population of Gaza out of Gaza. He was making little secret of it. You could find discussions of it at the time in the Israeli media. Various officials of the Israeli government, cabinet ministers, were openly talking about it, and so were various Israeli military officers. And Tony Blinken lent his support to this. He actually went even further in some respects than Donald Trump has done. He visited Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and he had discussions with the leaders of all of those countries, and he tried to persuade the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Saudis to actually endorse and back this plan. And all of the Arab states reacted furiously. There was a furious meeting between the Egyptian president, President al-Sisi, and Tony Blinken. Parts of it were televised, and I remember doing a program about this. And al-Sisi was so angry at the proposal that a furious telephone call between al-Sisi and Biden, the president himself, followed, in which Biden had to give assurances set out on the White House website that the entire displacement plan had in effect been abandoned, and that the United States, far from endorsing this plan, would in fact reverse it. So there we are. It's not a new plan. Trump is not the first American official to have spoken out in support of it. It has obviously originates from Israel. It obviously originates from within Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. Netanyahu himself is due to visit the United States, where he's going to be the first foreign leader to meet President Trump. Netanyahu tried to persuade the Biden administration to back it, and for several weeks he was successful in doing so. Now it's obvious to me that he's trying again with Donald Trump. Now, for the moment at least, just as Biden went along with Netanyahu's plan, Trump is doing so as well. I suspect that Trump will find that, just as Biden did, that opposition in the Islamic world to this terrible idea is altogether too strong. And I suspect that the plan will gradually be dropped. The fact that Trump over the weekend floated the possibility that the Palestinians might all go to Indonesia, which is not even an Arab country, suggests that there's been a very, very strong reaction from the Arab states, and that Trump, who doesn't want to give up with this idea, at least not for the moment, is now desperately looking for other Muslim countries that will go along with it. I suspect, I believe, that before long, in the face of Arab opposition, Muslim opposition, the idea will be dropped. But this episode tells us again that this remains very much something in the forefront of Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind, and that so long as he remains Prime Minister of Israel, he will continue to advocate for it. Just saying. Now, let's move on and let's discuss the situation in Ukraine and what has happened there, because we've had a massive interview. In fact, it's a follow-up to the previous interview by Putin. It's a television interview that Putin has given to his favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin. Now, annoyingly, but as is often the case with Putin-Zarubin interviews, the Kremlin for the moment is not providing us with a complete transcript. So we have to take the information about what Putin said from the Russian media. But the Russian media has, as one might expect, given us comprehensive account of what Putin said to Zarubin. And it is very interesting. Briefly, what Putin said to Zarubin is that on the very first day of the start of the special military operation, the Russians contacted the Ukrainians. Now, this has been widely known for some time, and we know that the official in question was in fact that Dmitry Kozak, Russia's representative on the Trilateral Contact Group, and that he telephoned Kiev at that time. The Ukrainians have at various times claimed that Kozak demanded Ukraine's unconditional surrender. Putin has now said, and this is consistent with the information that we had at the time, as I very well remember, that what Kozak actually said to the Ukrainians was that the Russian objectives, this is in February 2022, did not go beyond Donbass, that if the Ukrainians evacuated their forces from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, to the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which, according to the Russians, meant Donetsk and Lugansk regions. So it included places like Mariupol, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Lysychansk, all of these places, at that time, all of these places still under Ukrainian control. If the Ukrainians withdrew from those two regions, then the fighting would end. As I said, that is actually consistent with public statements that I remember the Russians making at the time. Well, according to Putin, the Ukrainians came back and they said they didn't agree, but they did offer negotiations. And the Russians said, fine, let's sit down and negotiate. By the way, it's worth bearing in mind that had the Ukrainians withdrawn their forces from Donetsk and Lugansk regions in February 2022 and had the fighting ended on the terms that Putin said, then there would have been no agreement between Russia and Ukraine about NATO membership. It would still, for the Russians, obviously, have remained a red line. But there would have been no actual agreement about NATO membership. And at that point, on that day, that's to say February 24th, 2022, Ukraine would have obviously lost control of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, but it would in theory still have been free to pursue NATO membership. Anyway, the Ukrainians said, no, we're not prepared to do that. We're prepared to negotiate instead. And negotiations followed, and they took place initially in Belarus, until eventually they were transferred to Turkey. But it turns out that already by the 12th of March, fairly early on, about just over 2 weeks after the start of the special military operation, a consensus had already been achieved on the main contours of the agreement, the peace agreement, and these had already been agreed by the Ukrainians and by the Russians. And Putin said that the proposals, this is all on the basis, essentially, of Ukrainian proposals. These were not fully in accordance with Russian objectives. I understand that the Ukrainians continue to resist diplomatic recognition, for example, of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The status of Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk was supposed to be put off until further negotiations, which might take as long as a decade to sort out. And it could even be, and Putin was not clear about this, that the Russians might have been taken aback by the Ukrainian demand that the Russians back their bid for EU membership. But Putin said that despite the fact that these were not, from a Russian point of view, completely perfect proposals, and despite Russian concerns that this was all fundamentally a trick, that the Ukrainians were simply going through the motions of negotiating in order to buy time, the Russians nonetheless decided to put their doubts and their misgivings to one side and to agree. Anyway, what then happened was that we had some rather complex toing and froing between the Ukrainians themselves, with the Russians waiting to see whether the Ukrainians would move forward to finalize the agreement. And then the meeting took place in Istanbul, and the Ukrainians came back with the agreement essentially initialed and told the Russians that the deal had, in effect, as far as they were concerned, that the deal had basically been done. There were one remaining issue that needed to be sorted out, and the Ukrainians wanted this to be discussed at an actual summit meeting between the Ukrainian and Russian presidents, between Zelensky and Putin himself, but that in all other respects, the deal had in effect been done. And the Russians basically agreed, and they then initialed the draft themselves. Now, Putin doesn't, I think, again, clarify. I haven't got a transcript, so I'm not sure, but he doesn't actually clarify what the one remaining unresolved issue was. But we've had lots of information about this from third-party sources, and it seems that it was the exact size of the Ukrainian military post-war. But anyway, this, as I said, was supposed to be agreed at a future meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And Zelensky also wanted long-term negotiations about the final status of the two Donetsk republics and about Crimea, but he accepted that they would fall fully under Russian control. So this was the agreement in Istanbul. And according to Putin, the Russians, as well as the Ukrainians, but the Russians themselves, kept the West fully up to date about all that was happening, that they were passing on information about the progress of the negotiations to the Western powers. He doesn't say, at least I'm not aware that he's provided information about which of the Western powers. But anyway, there was this communication with the Western powers. And, well, the agreement appeared to be signed. It wasn't yet fully sealed, but it was signed. There were still concerns and doubts in Russia about whether this was all for real. But the Western powers and the Ukrainians were pressing the Russians to withdraw their forces from Kiev. And as a goodwill gesture, given that the agreement appeared to have been reached, that was what the Russians then went ahead and did. And, well, after that, we all know the story. Boris Johnson, who had already telephoned Zelensky, telling him that he was unhappy about the terms of the agreement. The Americans apparently all of the European and Western governments informing the Ukrainians at that time that they were not really happy with this agreement. Anyway, as we then know, the agreement simply fell apart. The Ukrainians, having secured the withdrawal of Russian troops from the area around Kiev, simply went silent. They weren't prepared to embrace Russian counter proposals on some of the remaining issues. They didn't respond to a Russian document that was sent to them the next couple of days to move the diplomatic process forward. Contacts between the delegations simply ceased, and the Russians in April, May, found themselves in a diplomatic limbo where they appeared to reach an agreement, only that agreement was not put into any sort of effect. Now, this is Putin's account, and it's the most detailed account that he appears to have given up to now of the negotiations. And I'm going to make a number of observations about it. Firstly, it is after the collapse of Istanbul, the full details of which have never been explained, that the real war, the true conflict between Russia and Ukraine began. It was in response to Istanbul that the Western powers came up with the huge arms packages that have enabled the Ukrainians to prosecute the war ever since. And it was the result of the failure of Istanbul and of the Western arms packages that made the Russians decide over the course of summer 2022 that this was going to be a long war after all, that it was in effect a proxy war between the West and themselves, and not just a regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And it was at that time, in the summer of 2022, probably sometime after the fall of Lysychansk, but before Ukraine's offensives of the autumn, the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, that the Russians took the decision that they were in a long-term war and that they had no choice but to prosecute it until victory. And the signal that that decision had been made in Moscow at that time is a statement that Putin made over the course of the summer, in which he joked about the fact that the Ukrainians were planning an offensives, the offensives in Kherson and the offensives in Kharkiv. He said, let's see how far the Ukrainians get with those. But he also made the famous comment, we haven't got started yet. And it was, in fact, from that time that the Russians began to get started. So it was an enormously consequential event that took place then. But a lot of this, some of the detail is new, but a lot of this, the Russians have said before. General Kuyak and Paul Schulenberg in Germany have researched it and provided the details already. We've had quite a lot of information about Istanbul and about Boris Johnson's role. And, well, I suspect Tony Blinken also played a significant role. The other question is, why is Putin again bringing all this up once more? And the reason is, and he basically said this quite clearly over the course of his discussions with Zarubin, he said that the fundamental problem now is that the Russians have been deceived time and time again. They were deceived over the Minsk agreement. They were deceived over the Belarus-Istanbul negotiations in February, March, April 2022. They were basically having the wool spun over them, over their eyes. They were apparently warning each other, this is what Putin tells us, that might be the case at the time. They'd already had lots of experience of how they coming to agreements with the Ukrainians, only for the Ukrainians to walk away from the agreements the moment the Russians themselves seemed to go away. So, given that this is so, the Russians are going to approach any fresh negotiations to end the war in a completely different frame of mind from the ones they had during the Belarus and Istanbul discussions in the spring of 2022. And by the way, and just for the record, a huge amount has been said about the role of the Western powers, of the British, about Boris Johnson, about the Germans, the Americans. Very little has been said about Ukrainian motivations at the time. I remember Kirill Budanov, about a year and a half ago, actually giving an interview in which he said that Istanbul was a ruse, that the Ukrainians themselves, Zelensky and his government, never really intended it seriously. They were making all of these proposals to the Russians, knowing that the Russians would be attracted to them, and that all that they were doing was buying Ukraine time until Ukraine completed its mobilization and got the Russians to retreat from Kiev, and that they intended right from the start, the moment that happened, to go back on what they had purported to agree to. Now, that is Budanov. Budanov, of course, is the intelligence chief. At the time, he was an extreme hardliner. He seems to have moderated his positions slightly since then. It could be that what he says is not accurate of Zelensky's intentions in March 2022. But against that, Budanov did say it. The Ukrainians say very little about Istanbul today. They avoid discussing it whenever they can. And the Russians are not going to be unaware of what Budanov said. And no doubt that also factors into their calculations, as well as all of their other very difficult and bitter experiences of dealing with the Ukrainians, with the Minsk negotiations and everything else that both preceded and followed it. So Putin then went on to say that any deal, any final deal that had been done, or is going to be done now, obviously has to be informed on the Russian side by this history. And as he put it in rather apparently vivid language, every detail has to be worked out and polished to the last detail. There can be no loose ends or points of potential disagreement that the Ukrainians can wriggle behind in order to get out of the obligations that they have made. And presumably there would have to be strong enforcement mechanisms on the Russian side to ensure that the Ukrainians complied with whatever agreements they had reached. There are lots of people in the West who talk about enforcement mechanisms to keep the Russians to their side of any agreement. The people who say that are notable hardliners, by the way, who have no real desire for peace in Ukraine. They want that this is why they come up with ideas of peacekeeping forces and all of those sort of things, supposedly in order to keep the Russians to their word. Hardly anybody in the West ever says or appears to realize that from the Russian point of view, and with arguably more reason, it is the same. The Russians will insist on mechanisms whereby they can enforce any agreements that Ukraine enters into. And just to anticipate, part of those mechanisms is a massive scaling down of the Ukrainian armed forces. Quite plausibly, the presence of Russian troops in whatever is left of Ukraine, and an absolute prohibition on the presence of Western forces in any form on the territory of Ukraine as well. Western forces that the Ukrainians might be able to hide behind. So just saying, so that was what Putin said. But he also went on to discuss Zelensky himself. And here again, Putin, in a rather, by the way, from what I can understand, rather relaxed mood, took an extremely hard line. First of all, he came back to Zelensky's famous decree of 2nd October 2022, prohibiting himself or anyone else from conducting negotiations with Russia. And Putin said, obviously, that decree must be set aside because whilst it remains in place, Russia is in no position to agree anything with Ukraine. They can set up if the Ukrainians come up with negotiators, Russia can appoint its own negotiators, they can meet, they can hold discussions, they can pretend that this decree does not exist. But in the event that an agreement is in fact reached, that the whole validity, legality of that agreement comes into question because of the existence of this decree. the Ukrainians can hide behind the decree by saying that whatever it was that they eventually agreed with the Russians has no legal force because it is contrary to this decree. So the decree must be set aside. But then, and Putin again said that this was in effect the trap, as he put it. The problem comes that Zelensky himself is no longer, as far as the Russians are concerned, in a position to rescind the decree. Because even though he is, as Putin said, the head of the Kiev regime, he is no longer the constitutional president of Ukraine. His constitutional term expired in May 2024. And so he has no legal right to sign any document. He had the right to sign a document, the decree, on the 2nd of October 2022, because at that time he was the legal president of Ukraine, but he has no right to sign another document reversing the decree now, because since he is not the legal president of Ukraine, that reversal of the decree would be a nullity. Now, I have to say here that Putin is, to some extent, playing games. I've discussed this in many places. Putin may be absolutely right about Zelensky's constitutional status. He's had, obviously, a lot of legal advice about this from people within the Russian foreign ministry. I'm not here to argue the point of legal advice, the legal advice that Putin is being given. But I do question whether at the end of the day, given that Ukraine is an internationally recognized state and that the Ukrainian government continues to receive international recognition, including at the United Nations, whether it is really for Putin to come forward and act as the judge as to who is the president of Ukraine and who is not. Putin, of course, can say that any document that Zelensky signs has no legal validity, that will affect any agreement that Russia ultimately reaches with him. A member of the Duran community has very usefully and helpfully pointed out that one of the fundamental problems with the original Minsk agreement is that the Ukrainian parliament never formally endorsed it, which was another factor that makes the Russians particularly sensitive about the legality, or at least Ukrainian conceptions on the legality of any document that their representatives or purported representatives sign. But putting all that aside, as I said, the fundamental point here clearly is that what Putin is signaling, whether you agree with his legal analysis or not, whether you agree that Putin has a right to undertake that kind of a legal analysis, what he is basically signaling, what he is effectively saying, is that there can be no peace between Russia and Ukraine whilst Vladimir Zelensky remains Ukraine's president. The issue is not whether, I suspect the Russians at the end of the day, whether Zelensky is Ukraine's constitutional president or not, what the legalities are. But the fact that the Russians feel that Zelensky and his officials spun them a tale in Belarus and Istanbul in 2022, putting aside what roles the British and the Americans and the others might have had. And that in light of that, Zelensky simply cannot be trusted. That he is a fundamentally untrustworthy leader, that any signature he or his representatives put on a document is not worth the paper it's written on. And in light of that, if there is going to be peace in Ukraine, an actual agreement in Ukraine, Zelensky must go. Now, Putin has floated the possibility in the past that Zelensky might subject himself to elections, and there might be elections, and that if he is validly elected president of Ukraine, then the Russians might reconsider the question of his status. But I think that the Russians probably calculate that Zelensky is not keen to do that, and that for that reason they don't really worry or concern themselves with that possibility. They believe, in other words, that Zelensky must go. The Russians never like officially to say that they are seeking regime change in a country. They always insist that that is not something they are ever going to do. Dmitry Medvedev has at times talked about it, but Putin never has. This is Putin's very elegant way of communicating to the Ukrainians and obviously to the Trump administration that in reality, in order to get negotiations going, it's not just the decree that Zelensky signed that is the problem. It is Zelensky himself. And so long as he is there, there can be no peace in Ukraine. Now, I have to say that I personally think that this underlying analysis is correct, in the sense that I too believe that Zelensky is now in that position where he too is never going to agree to a peace, a genuine peace settlement in Ukraine. He's going to do everything he can to prevent and obstruct and sabotage any peace agreement. In fact, he has been doing so consistently ever since the summer, when he first proposed his so-called victory plan, which is all about him being given Tomahawk missiles and NATO membership immediately and Western troops in Ukraine. He's been coming up with idea after idea after idea to keep the war going, to get the West deeply involved in the fighting in Ukraine, because he understands that his political position and perhaps his physical survival will be in doubt if there is ever a serious move towards peace in Ukraine. Now, again, that's my view. The Russians, for perhaps somewhat different reasons, which is that Zelensky simply cannot be trusted, have also decided that Zelensky will never agree to peace in Ukraine. I think that the Americans, the Trump people, if they are really serious about achieving peace in Ukraine, need to think about these points that Putin is making. Now, on that score, I'm going to return shortly, in a short time, to the Trump administration and what it is, or to be precise, isn't doing at the present time. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation based on what Putin has said. Now, before I leave this topic of diplomacy and personal diplomacy, I'm going to return to the topic of the Budapest Memorandum briefly, yet again, for the umpteenth time. This is largely because, again, a number of people, one person in particular, has forwarded to me the text of the Budapest Memorandum, with which I'm very familiar with, by the way, saying that the memorandum does in fact refer to Ukraine agreeing to give up its nuclear missiles. What this person is referring to is the part of the Budapest Memorandum which sets out what lawyers refer to as the recitals. The recitals set out in very brief paragraphs the circumstances that bring about the document, in this case the memorandum, that the substance of which is set out in its main part. And the provision in question in the recitals reads as follows: taking into account the commitment of Ukraine to eliminate all nuclear weapons from its territory within a specified period of time. Now, to say straight away, this does not refer to Ukrainian nuclear weapons. It refers to eliminate all nuclear weapons from its territory within a specified time. Now, here I have to mention briefly, and I apologize for the technical issue, a fundamental principle of legal analysis, or at least analysis of legal documents, what British lawyers call legal construction. Now, I am familiar with this principle from domestic documents, British legislation, but many years ago I asked an international lawyer, a very celebrated international lawyer who lectured on international law, where the same principle applies to international legal documents, and he told me that it absolutely does. Anyway, this principle is that you do not read more into words than they say. So the document does not say that these are nuclear weapons. It doesn't identify the nuclear weapons as Ukrainian. It doesn't say that they belong to Ukraine. It doesn't say that Ukraine has in any form of ownership or control over them. It says that Ukraine commits itself to eliminate all nuclear weapons from its territory. So that, of course, encompasses the old Soviet nuclear weapons present on Ukrainian territory that were left over on Ukrainian territory after the end of the Soviet Union, and which continue to be under the operational command of Russia's Strategic Forces Command in Moscow. That is what that sentence actually says. If it was talking about Ukrainian nuclear weapons, it would have described them in that way. Just saying. Now, since the topic of the Budapest Memorandum has been brought up again for the umpteenth time, I ought to say that if you actually read the provisions of the Budapest Memorandum, it does provide the Russians with a sort of legal case for what they did, because it said that though the Russians, along with the other great powers, do not intend commit themselves to respect the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine, and not to conduct military action against it. It does inevitably and always provide the usual get out that, of course, this is consistent with the United Nations Charter, the Charter of the United Nations, and the various principles of international law, and all of that. And of course, the Russians have argued that they did in fact act in accordance with the UN Charter and with the international law and all of those things, because they were taking steps in effect to defend themselves. I don't myself think, and I say straightforwardly, that the Russians have a particularly strong case here, because, at least in international law, because I think that the Russians, in theory at least, should have gone to the UN Security Council if they really did believe that there was a threat to themselves from Ukraine before starting the special military operation. And of course they didn't. And I think if you read the memorandum clearly, you can see that this is in fact how the memorandum is constructed. But I have to say, this is true of almost all international documents that I've seen. Always the Security Council and the United Nations are given central importance. And in practice, they never are. I can only think of 3 cases where great powers have gone to war and have gone through the machinery that they're supposed to do, which is go to the Security Council first before taking military action. The first instance that I can remember was in 1982, the Falklands crisis, where whatever your views about what the British did are, the fact is that the British government did first go to the Security Council and did get Security Council resolutions for Argentina to withdraw from the Falklands Islands, and Argentina refused to comply with those resolutions. Then the second occasion was in 1990, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. It was a time of cooperation between all the great powers. Gorbachev's Soviet Union was going out of its way to be as helpful at that time to the United States as it could, as I well remember. The result was a succession of Security Council resolutions which required Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. And again, it didn't do so, and that again arguably led to the authorized use of force later. And the third occasion was in 2008, after Georgia attacked Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia and in South Ossetia. The Russian president of that time, Dmitry Medvedev, first made a request through the Russian delegation to the Security Council for action. The Security Council refused to act because the Western powers backed Georgia, but at least Russia went through the motions, and one could argue on that basis that their response afterwards, their counter against Georgia, was fully in conformity with international law. Those are the only 3 cases I can think of when, as I said, the proper machinery was followed. In October 2023, after Israel was attacked by Hamas, as I have repeatedly pointed out, Israel did not make use of this machinery. It paid no attention to the United Nations or the Security Council at all. It, with the full support of the United States and of the other Western powers, instead went headlong into this terrible war in Gaza, which has proved to be a diplomatic and geopolitical disaster, a military defeat, and a step towards a moral abyss. So, well, as I said, I do think the Russians probably, in strict law, have a very weak case if one followed international law based on the Budapest Memorandum. But it is no weaker than that routinely, or that you could say was true of the many other great powers that have taken steps at various times, military steps, without paying proper attention to the Security Council, the United Nations, and its charter. I don't intend to return to this topic again, by the way. It comes up regularly. The Budapest Memorandum is brought up all the time. In my opinion, by now, it has become a red herring. Well, there we go. Now, I said that I would return to the Trump administration, and I'm going to make an observation. Yesterday, I discussed in my program how there's been no telephone call between Putin and Trump. There has been no publicly disclosed peace proposal that the Russians can comment about and work with from the Trump administration. Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister, says that except for basic level contacts between embassies, there are no real discussions between the Americans and the Russians at the moment at all. The Trump administration seems to be in no anxiety to do anything on the diplomatic front with which to end the war in Ukraine. Now, yesterday in my program, I speculated that perhaps the real strategy of the Trump administration with Ukraine is to run down the clock, that they're just sitting back and are letting events in Ukraine take their course. They've come to understand that they have no real leverage over the Russians at all. Trump, at the speech to the WEF, called on the Saudis and the other OPEC states to take action to flood the world with cheap oil and lower oil prices. Well, there's been a meeting of OPEC Plus at which the OPEC Plus states, including the Saudis, reiterated that they have no intention of acting on any of these kind of demands. They're going to stick with the already agreed plan, which envisages a small increase in oil production. From April, they're not going to take any action before. So the Trump people have come to understand that they have no real leverage over the Russians. And Donald Trump, who is probably by now getting reasonably, well, I won't say accurate, but at least some factual information about Ukraine, but who also probably dislikes getting drawn into negotiations where he has no leverage and where he can see that the other side has all the high cards. It could be that he's just decided that he's just going to keep away. He's going to just let events take their course. And there's been more interesting disclosures in the American media about the stop orders. We've had information, both from the New York Times and I believe the Washington Post, that the stop order on aid to Ukraine does indeed involve some military assistance after all. This has never been clearly explained or defined, The text of the stop orders has not been disclosed, and we're not being told whom these stop orders are being addressed to. But I speculated in previous programs that military aid to Ukraine is provided under many different programs by the United States. Mostly it comes through the Department of Defense, but it's likely that the CIA and the State Department also has its own military assistance programs to Ukraine, providing funding which Ukraine then uses for weapons. Well, it looks as if something like that might be affected as well. So there we go. It looks as if the squeeze on Ukraine does extend to some degree of military cut-off as well. And obviously that is causing alarm in Ukraine itself, despite all the denials about military aid not being affected. And that something is indeed going on, and that the Ukrainians themselves are increasingly rattled by what has happened, is shown by the fact that there is now a furious dispute between the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, and the head of the procurement agency in Ukraine, with Umerov trying to sack the head of the procurement agency, and the procurement agency countering by accusing him of corruption and subjecting Umerov to corruption allegations and apparently investigations. Now, when this happens in Ukraine, I think firstly, two things to say. We can take the corruption as a given, but it is very likely that this is another expression of political crisis, political tension. I discussed in yesterday's program how, as the situation deteriorates for Ukraine, we would likely see growing evidence that there is a political crisis starting to develop in Ukraine. Budanov's comments that Ukraine has just 6 months being a case in point. And here we see further evidence in this huge row of evolving political tensions. Now, at this point, I suppose I ought to do a very brief summary about the military situation in Ukraine. It is going to be very brief today. Apparently, there has been, as by the way sometimes happens in this part of the world, a sudden sharp thaw. Temperatures rose to 20 degrees Celsius. The result is that a lot of the ice and snow has melted and turned the ground into mud. I've seen some pictures. And of course, this has slowed movement on all sides. But we're getting further news in several places of more Russian advances. And there's reports of the semi-encirclement of Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians are claiming all kinds of counterattacks in Toretsk region, about which, by the way, I'm going to reserve judgment until I have had a little bit more information. But I doubt that these have any specific or very important consequences. Perhaps more interesting is that the Russian army, the Russian Defense Ministry, has now confirmed that the village of Novoyelizavetovka has indeed been captured. And our old friends, the defense circles, that is to say someone within the Russian military, has now told TASS Novoyelizavetovka expands the bridgehead and it expedites the advance towards Dnipro region. Now that is the first confirmation from an official Russian source, one within the Russian military, that there is indeed an intention by the Russians to advance into Dnipro region at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. In other words, it does look as if the Russians are indeed heading for the river. And there's been pictures published of bomb damage in Mercouris. It looks as if the town is now being heavily shelled and bombed. Probably over the next few weeks, once the thaw ends and the ground hardens up again, we'll start to see a major push by the Russians further westwards, and the work to encircle Mercouris finished, and then the Russians will push to the river, and then the real crisis for Ukraine will begin. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget to check out the to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button if you like this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.